लेखन भी समय समय पर कई चिंतकों के प्रभाव के अधीन विकसित होता आया है। अक्सर हम खद्दर से कार तक तो जो पुराने पाठ्यक्रम हैं तो इतिहासकारों की चर्चा और आजकल और भी कई उत्तर संरचनावादी इतिहासकारों की चर्चा तो कर रहे हैं, करते रहते हैं, और समय समय पर विकसित कई वादों के परिप्रेक्ष्य में लिखित इतिहास को देखने के बाद ये उपनिवेशवादी लेखन प्रणालियाँ फिर जो अलग अलग ही हमें दिखाई देती हैं, क्योंकि शासकों के रूप में इतिहास को या इतिहास गति को तो उपनिवेशवादी इतिहास लेखक जो हैं तो अपनी दृष्टि से अपनी आवश्यकताओं के अनुसार व्याख्या करते रहते हैं, और कई संदर्भों में शासन की सत्ता में उभरने वाले विचारों को जो समाज में अलग अलग विचार उभरते हैं उनको गैर कानूनी करार कर देते हैं और साहित्य को भी प्रतिबंधित कर देते हैं। तो भारत के इतिहास में इस प्रकार के गैर कानूनी घोषित करने की कई घटनाएं दिखाई देती हैं। तो इस क्रम में उपनिवेशवादी इतिहास लेखन प्रणाली के कारण तो इतिहास लेखन में अपेक्षित राष्ट्रीय दृष्टि है तो ये भ्रमित भी हो जाती है। तो आज़ादी के अमृत महोत्सव मनाने के संदर्भ में इतिहास लेखन प्रणाली की ओर हमारा ध्यान जा रहा है और प्रतिबंधित हिंदी उर्दू मुद्रित साहित्य का पुनरावलोकन करके नए सिरे से चिंतन करने की ओर हम सोच रहे हैं। तो वास्तव में ये इतिहास चिंतन सत्य को प्रतिष्ठित करने की ओर हमारा ध्यान आकृष्ट करता है और आत्मनिर्भर भारत की दृष्टि से सच्चे अर्थ में इतिहास के निर्माण की दृष्टि से तथ्य और साक्ष्यों को प्राप्त करते हुए अतीत का निष्पक्ष और सच्चा रूप प्रस्तुत करने की दृष्टि से प्रतिबंधित हिंदी उर्दू साहित्य का अध्ययन तो ये नितांत आवश्यक हो जाता है। तो अब इस क्रम में हमारे गजेंद्र जी ने कदम उठाया है। तो आशा करता हूँ कि इस संगोष्ठी के बल पर एक सही दृष्टि और एक नया आलोक मिलेगा और इसकी सहायता से भारत के इतिहास के विद्यार्थी अपनी सांस्कृतिक अस्मिता को प्रतिष्ठित कर सकेंगे और भारत के विश्वविद्यालयों में भारतीय इतिहास और संस्कृति का अध्ययन अध्यापन जिस रूप में हो रहा है उससे भारत की चिंतन परंपरा और सम्यक दृष्टि का सही अर्थ में परिचय नहीं हो पा रहा है। तो अब इस दिशा में कुछ आगे सही दृष्टि में करने के लिए मौका तो मिलेगा। तो क्योंकि समय समय पर यूरोप और अमेरिका से आयातित जो एकेडमिक फ्रेमवर्क है तो हमारे चिंतन को तो ये फ्रेमवर्क सीमित करता जा रहा है। तो इस संदर्भ में गंभीर रूप से सोचने वाले बुद्धिजीवी जो हैं तो इस तरह के विषयों पर सोचने की आवश्यकता महसूस कर रहे हैं। प्रोफेसर गजेंद्र पाठक और उनके सहयोगी समाज विकास अध्ययन केंद्र के मित्रों ने इस विषय को चुनकर आज़ादी के अमृत महोत्सव के अवसर पर भारत के सही इतिहास लेखन की दिशा में कदम उठाया है। तो मैं उनको साधुवाद देता हूँ और आशा करता हूँ कि संगोष्ठी में सफल चर्चाएं होंगी और कुछ नए तथ्य सामने आएंगे। धन्यवाद, बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। धन्यवाद गजेंद्र जी।
Thank you, Professor Sir Raju. As Professor Sir Raju pointed out, this conference is indeed going to be an important step towards enriching the recorded history of India. We will aim at bringing out the contradictions of the colonizers and the colonized and the multiple contradictions within the historiography will be dealt with by delving deeper into the proscribed literature so far. Now I would like to call upon the Honorable Chair of the session, Professor V. Krishna, Dean School of Humanities, Professor V. Krishna has been an integral part of Department of Hindi, University of Hyderabad. His area of expertise is modern poetry, comparative literature, Dalit literature, and Hindi teaching as a second language. I welcome Professor V. Krishna, Dean School of Humanities.
Thank you, Divya. आज के इस अंतर्राष्ट्रीय आयोजन के लिए मैं गजेंद्र जी को और उनके साथियों को धन्यवाद देता हूं और अभिनंदन करता हूं। शायद इस महामारी के दौरान इतना बड़ा आयोजन करना कोई मामूली बात नहीं है। प्रतिष्ठित संस्थान की परियोजना के अंतर्गत गजेंद्र जी ने बहुत कुछ किया है और गजेंद्र जी ने जेएनयू के दौरान जो हासिल किया है, शायद ये जो आयोजन है उसी का विस्तृत फलक है। और इस महत्वपूर्ण सत्र की अध्यक्षता करने के लिए मुझे आमंत्रित किया है। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। इस संगोष्ठी में कई वरिष्ठ विद्वान बैठे हैं। रवि भूषण जी सर बैठे हैं और मुझे बड़ी खुशी हो रही है कि मेरे पुराने साथी जेएनयू के डॉक्टर रुस्तुम भी बैठे हैं। कुछ यादों में खो रहा हूं लेकिन नहीं जाऊंगा उनमें। अच्छा लग रहा है, बहुत अच्छा लग रहा है। जेएनयू की यादें ताजा होने लगी हैं। सहज है, लेकिन मैं ज्यादा समय नहीं लूंगा, 2-3 मिनट, क्योंकि मैं भी आपके जैसे ही मैं राधा वल्लभ जी को सुनना चाहता हूं और भी कई विद्वान हैं उनको सुनना चाहता हूं। और रविकांत जी भी बैठे हैं। उनसे मेरा कोई व्यक्तिगत परिचय नहीं है, लेकिन उनके बारे में मैंने सुना है। बहुत सक्रिय, मैं क्या कार्यकर्ता कहूं या विद्वान कहूं, कभी कभी समझ में नहीं आता, क्योंकि पहले ही हम लोग प्रतिबंधित साहित्य को लेकर विचार कर रहे हैं। अगर कार्यकर्ता कहूं तो कतरे से बाहर नहीं है। ठीक है, प्रतिबंधित साहित्य और उसका इतिहास शायद हम सब लोग जानते हैं। ये कोई नया विषय नहीं है, बहुत पुराना है। आजादी से पहले, आजादी के बाद भी प्रतिबंधित का इतिहास है। हम तो सोचते थे कि गुलामी के दिनों में कोई रचनाकार जागरूक हैं, लिख रहा है और व्यवस्था उनसे खुश नहीं थी, प्रतिबंधित कर दिया है। उस समय की बात तो समझ में आती है, लेकिन आजादी के बाद भी कई रचनाएं प्रतिबंधित है। ये भी इतिहास हमारे सामने है। फिलहाल गजेंद्र जी ने औपनिवेशिक इतिहास लेखन की ओर संकेत किया है, लेकिन आजादी के बाद के दिनों को भी लेकर सोचना बहुत जरूरी है। वैसे व्यक्ति और व्यवस्था या समाज दोनों के बीच हमेशा टकराव का वातावरण है। अंतर्विरोध, संघर्ष ये हमेशा रहा, क्योंकि व्यक्ति सोचता है और जो सोचता है उसे अभिव्यक्त करना चाहता है, एक सहज गुण है। अब मुक्तिबोध ने कहा था अभिव्यक्ति के संकट खतरे उठाने ही होंगे। तो ये अभिव्यक्ति जब व्यवस्था से, समाज से टकराने लगती है, और ये क्यों टकराती है, ये बहुत जरूरी है सोचना। क्यों हमारे बीच का ही एक व्यक्ति व्यवस्था की यथास्थिति के विरुद्ध आवाज उठाता है, परंपरा के विरोध में आवाज उठाता है, अत्याचार अन्याय के विरोध आवाज उठाता है, शोषण के विरोध, दमन के विरोध आवाज उठाता है। क्यों व्यवस्था के जो पक्षधर हैं या व्यवस्था के जो कर्णधार है उनकी अभिव्यक्ति पर प्रतिबंध, रोक लगाते हैं। ये जाति को लेकर हो सकता है, धर्म को लेकर हो सकता है, समाज को लेकर हो सकता है, अलग अलग नाम दिए गए हैं, पूरा इतिहास हमारे सामने है। इसको लेकर, क्योंकि ये भारत के संदर्भ में ही नहीं, बड़ा अच्छा शीर्षक दिया है गजेंद्र जी ने, औपनिवेशिक। औपनिवेशिक केवल भारत के संदर्भ में ही नहीं है, पूरे विश्व के विभिन्न संदर्भों में हम इसको अनुभव करते हैं। और ये प्रतिबंधित करने की जो मानसिकता है विश्वव्याप्त है। कभी कोई लेखक हो सकता है, कभी कोई संगठन हो सकता है, कभी कोई रचना हो सकती है, कभी कोई फिल्म हो सकती है। पूरा इतिहास हमारे सामने है। इसलिए मुझे लगता है इस पर विचार होना बहुत जरूरी है। अब नया इतिहास कैसे लिखेंगे, इतिहास लेखन की समस्याएं क्या क्या है, यानी उस व्यवस्था को जब तक हम नहीं जानते हैं जो प्रतिबंधित करने के लिए आतुर होती है, कोई सही इतिहास आप नहीं लिख पाएंगे। कौन है वो व्यक्ति की स्वतंत्रता को, आजादी को खत्म करना चाहता है? इसे समझने की बहुत जरूरत है। सभी नहीं है, व्यवस्था इतनी छोटी भी नहीं है उतनी आसानी से आपको पकड़ में आए। हमारे मित्र सराजू ने बहुत बढ़िया बात कही है, आजादी का अमृतोत्सव, बहुत अच्छा कहा। इस आजादी के अमृतोत्सव के दौरान क्या डॉक्यूमेंटेशन हम करेंगे, किसका डॉक्यूमेंटेशन करेंगे? उस डॉक्यूमेंटेशन के द्वारा कौन सा भविष्य हम दिखाएंगे, कौन सा भविष्य के कौन से सपने को हम दर्शाएंगे, ये बहुत जरूरी है। केवल हिंदी उर्दू तक ही नहीं है ये बात, विश्व की तमाम भाषाओं में इसका इतिहास मिलता है। मैं जानता हूं तेलुगु में कितनी रचनाएं प्रतिबंधित हुई है, कौन कौन लेखक हैं आप सब लोग जानते हैं। आजकल के दौर में इस प्रतिबंधित साहित्य पर चर्चा करना ही बहुत साहस की बात है। इसके लिए मैं गजेंद्र जी को और उनकी पूरी टीम को हृदय से बधाई देता हूं, धन्यवाद देता हूं कि मुझे इस महत्वपूर्ण संगोष्ठी के प्रथम सत्र की उद्घाटन सत्र की अध्यक्षता के लिए आमंत्रित किया है। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। गजेंद्र जी। ओवर टू दिव्या।
Hello. Okay. Do we have Divya? Okay, does not matter. My name is Ravi Khan, and I hope you can see me. The lights are not really proper. And we are trying to connect different places and speak in different tongues, in different languages, and trying to connect with, people, scholars globally. So I welcome you all to this international conference on proscribed Hindi Urdu print and colonial historiography. We should, take some pride. This is very much part of the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav launched by the central government. But we should take some pride in saying, and we were talking about it, Gajendra ji and I, Ashutosh and Naushad, the team, we were talking about it yesterday, that we anticipated Amrit Mahotsav in certain ways. We started celebrating it when we wrote the project and we started working on it. The pandemic has caused a lot of disturbances in our field work, but we hope that we will, start it with fresh energy. And this conference, in which a lot of great scholars are participating, we still want to listen to them. We don't have anything great to offer from the organizer's side. We want to collect the wisdom of scholars who have worked on the topic for a number of years. That's why we have invited scholars like Professor Shahid Amin, Professor Radha Vallabh Tripathi, and Professor Wendy Singer, Professor Charu Gupta, and a whole lot of others, and also some students. So the idea behind the organization of this conference is basically the idea of learning. But what I want to suggest is that since there are many tongues in which we will speak, we should also pay attention to the details of meanings gained and lost when we speak. For example, Pratibandhit Sahitya is one thing, Zabt Shuda Sahitya is another, banned literature is quite another. So there are technical differences that have legal implications in historiography as well as in scholarship, in colonial historiography and colonial jurisprudence, as well as that followed. So what is it that we are trying to address? We are trying to address, I think, the whole range. And we are trying to create some confusion in the field. We don't want to be, Professor Raju, stick to the material that has already been excavated. It's our duty to go beyond Hindi Urdu. It's also, we will try and gather as much material as we can. As part of this project, it has a site which is audiovisual. Not much work has been done on the visual side of the banned, proscribed literature. We want to focus on that. And we also want scholars to pay attention to certain other languages that we will not have time to address. So you can see in the program that there's a whole range of plays, poetry, cartoons, speeches, and there are also gaps between what was orally available, what was being performed, and then what was being ultimately printed. We know that from oral to performance to print, there are several journeys that these revolutionaries, these nationalist, these patriots were undertaking. And they were using all the possible media forms at their disposal to convey what they had to. There are also rumors, and we have, so Shahid Amin, who will speak to us, who has written eloquently about this transition in Gandhi's mind. So much to the rumors being printed as in Swadesh newspaper. Similarly, from Professor Radha Vallabh Tripathi, we have learned so far not much was written and not much was available on Sanskrit literature. But he has, in one of his earlier lectures, I don't know whether he's present today or not, but in one of his earlier lectures, he told us about the plays written in Sanskrit and also banned by the colonial government. So we want to leave it open right now. We will, when we organize another conference next year or next to next year, we'll have much more to offer intellectually and source-wise, and we'll have a website ready on which we'll present a whole lot of things. We'll make one radio, propose to make one cinema around film around this. So it will be an ongoing discussion for the next for 2 more years. And I'm really thankful to Professor Nair and others, Professor Raju and Professor Krishna Menon and others at the University of Hyderabad, Institute of Excellence, for providing us all the possible support. And that is where I'll stop. And I would invite Divya once again to take over and invite our speakers, keynote speakers in the session. Okay. Is Divya around? All right. Sorry for these technical glitches. Professor Shahid Amin, please be seated. We will start. I don't know whether Professor Radha Vallabh Tripathi is around. No, we tried calling him. He's not well, and he has apologized to all of you for disappointing you for not being here. So I will call Professor Shahid Amin. Let me say a few words. He's been my ustad, my guru at University of Delhi. I've had the pleasure of, sitting in his class and getting taught from, material that was being freshly minted. And we've been lucky as that. And we have shared that excitement of the books that he wrote. Professor Shahid Amin, as you all know, retired from Delhi University, but he's been a visiting faculty in Columbia and several other universities abroad, also at CSDS and at Jamia Millia Islamia. He's been a founding member of the editorial collective called Subaltern Studies, which kind of changed the way we look at colonial historiography, history of, subaltern history of people, how peasants tried speaking about the moments of rebellion and how they managed to communicate, in spite of the censorship of all kinds, communicate their ire to the authorities that be. So Professor Shahid Amin has written, as you know, Event Metaphor Memory, very famously, and also the famous book on Ghazi Mia, and he's now been working for some years now on Ram Garib Chaube, who was a subaltern informant to George Grierson, famous linguist, and he's also compiled recently, and with the Tridip Suhit, the documents of Champaran Satyagraha. So he has a lot to offer on this year of Amrit Mahotsav. And I will now invite Professor Shahid Amin. We have the images that you have sent us, and we'll show those images from here. Professor Shahid Amin, most welcome. Please start your keynote.
Thank you, Ravi Khan, and distinguished chairpersons and visitors to this conference. I shall get on with whatever little I have to say straight away. Of course, my grateful thanks to the organizers and to Ravi Khan for inviting me and making me think about some of the material that I've been engaged with for a long time. I have decided to title this Print, Subversion, Proscription. Now, this is a very general title as far as the period is concerned. But can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes, very much.
Yeah. But I shall, of course, be focusing on printed material, largely textual, but also some prints during the period 1920s, 30s. Now, subversion, I'll say a couple of things before we come to the proper print, which is something that is printed in a printing press, because that's what draws the ire of the state, because it's not simply what has been written, but the fact that it might circulate. Now, first, subversion, just a couple of things about subversion. Obviously, subversion, to begin with, is oral. In all languages, there are what linguists have called pronouns of power. Vous, tu in French, आप, तुम, tu in Hindi. And in a kind of a hierarchical society, some people say tu to others are supposed to say आप. And the very inversion of this, a peasant calling a landlord, tu kya kar raha hai, tune kya kiya, is subversion and is construed as subversion. Hence that popular expression, main teri zaban nikal lunga. So it's the tongue which is the source of speech, which can be very subversive, not by doing very much, but just constructing a sentence, which is not expected to emanate from a person who's subordinate. Subversion is also very much in place with oral dissemination, rumors, which make every hearer a transmitter, and you can't really get hold on it. There are some very interesting words in Hindi and Bhojpuri on and Urdu on rumor. Afwah, we all know. There's another one called hoga. But I think that the best word that I came across was udan ghai, something that is really flying around. That is something which is in the air. Subversion can also be through munadi, through circulation, through announcement, through the pasting of posters, which was the case normally before print became widespread. Now, regarding nationalist poetry, which I'll be focusing on a bit more, also on prose. Let me begin with a couple of general statements. One is not born a nationalist. one becomes one. And that is through hearing things, listening to things, and therefore responding to it in an appropriate way. That is why, while we have a lot of nationalist poems, Prabhat Pheri is one of them, new construction, that early in the morning children would go out and sing nationalist songs through the city. Though we have children engaged in nationalist songs, it's interesting and worth noting that there are very few nationalist lullabies. Nationalist lori mere nazdik abhi tak koi aa nahi pai. So it's not nationalism, and the poetry of nationalism is addressed really to adult population. Now I'll focus on the Gandhian movement, as I call it, 1920, 1930, 31, these two movements. Now, there is subversion and prescription of two sorts. One is the prevention of individuals, most remarkably Gandhi, from entering a particular area. So Gandhi is not allowed to go to Punjab when the Rowlatt oppression has taken place. Similarly, newspapers that report extensively on the oppression in Punjab during 1919 are confiscated. Entire issues of newspapers are confiscated. Just reporting without any incendiary comments is seen as excuse me, I've got a very bad cough. So it leads to prescription of an entire issue. The very famous Gorakhpur newspaper Swadesh, the 1919 April edition, is proscribed and banned. When we come to the poetry of nationalism, that's when things really get exciting. That's when things get interesting. One could almost say, and that nationalism made poets of a lot of people who were not poets and who would never be poets. So it's not, nationalist poetry is not absolutely first-rate compositions. It is the intensity of the feeling that gets conveyed through poetry that really causes concern. And I don't have to emphasize that poetry touches your heart much more so, much more direct manner than prose does. People have, and now archives, both provincial and national, have produced collections of proscribed pamphlets. They are called variously Swatantra pamphlets, or Desh Bhakti Ki Bhavnaएं, Hubbul Watni, where you will get poetry of indifferent sort combined with some very, very famous poems which are construed in a very, very strong nationalist way, so that there is, in most collections, a lot of collections, you will get Iqbal Sare Jahan Se Acha, or Bismill's Sarfaroshi Ki Tamanna. But there are pamphlets and booklets which really the state was very concerned about and proscribed straight away, which were incendiary, quote unquote, in the language of the state. And that is evidence in the very title of these. So you've got booklets of poems with such titles as Gore Kutton Ka Haramipan, the bastardly ways of white dogs; Dumkati Sarkar, that is an inversion of Kipling's notorious phrase of Bandar Log, or Akbar's, and you can relate it to Akbar's satirical verse, whereby he says, Ya ilahi ye kaise bandar hain, Ya ilahi ye kaise bandar hain, irtiqa pe bhi aadmi na hue. That is, there's evolution from apes to human beings, and Akbar Abadi is referring to the Angrez who have not developed into proper human beings and have remained still at the ape level. Now, these are really incendiary statements as far as the colonial state is concerned. A little background: these pamphlets that I've been just alluded to, I'll say something more on them. They are published from small towns. I'm looking at UP, and they're really written by inferior but clever and highly educated poets. This is not Maithili Sharan Gupta really writing, whose writings could be confiscated, but the large number of pamphlets that are now available in the provincial archives, in the National Archives, in the British Library are, very powerful poems, but not really by professional poets. And these are largely written, as can be understood, by upper caste males. Very few women poets, very few pamphlets authored by women poets, or very few proscribed pamphlets at that time, not subsequently, in 1920s and 30s, authored by Dalit caste really are to be found in the large collection that we have at various places, and that says something about the nature of leadership and the nature of mobilization. What we find again in these collections, and I'm looking at again 1920s and 30s, is a transition from a non-violent sentiment, and of course non-cooperation is the key modality of that, is non-violence. We see a transition from a non-violent to an abrasive, militant, even violent rubrics or titles. So one could almost trace a progression from, say, Asayog, Swaraj ki Gitanjali, Rashtriya Tufan, now we are getting in there, Gandhi Ghor Sangram, Gandhi ki Top, and even Gandhi ki Nangi Talwar. Now, these collections are not one long poem, they are a collection of several poems. But the title itself is meant to be subversive. If you call a collection of poems published from Kasganj or Devariya, Gore Kutto Ka Harami Pan or Gandhi Ki Nangi Talwar, that's the kind of contradiction in terms. That stray is also meant to draw attention to the state, but also in a very peculiar way, is supposed to be a mobilizational title. For instance, there is in Dumkati Sarkar, which is a collection of poems, it starts with this couplet: बहुत दिन कर लिया आराम मखमल के गदेलों पे, सुलाऊंगा तुम्हें आज पत्थर और ढेलों पे. That you have been lounging on cushions and so on for long. Now we are going to really make you lie down on clods and stones. So you see that there are the addressee is normally, of course, the peasant or even women in some cases, in a large number of cases, who are to be organized. But the intent is very clearly adversarial, addressed in this case to the Englishman. Now, coming to the iconography, Ravi Khan, Ravi Khan will just display some of these illustrations. Ravi Khan, can we just I'll just go through a set and then say a little bit about each of those illustrations. So let me carry on. So there is a pamphlet which is there's a, yeah, this will come to later on. Can you just, okay, let me just, yeah. So you look at, this is Vande Mataram, Congress ka Bigel or Dukhiya Bharat. Look at the way, look at the typeface. There is Bharat Mata really dressed as in the guise of Saraswati, because the veena is prominent, and Gandhi is just actually blowing into a megaphone, and 4 people representing various communities are there. If you look at the small print, it's a pamphlet which has been produced by someone who's not fully in command of Hindi spelling or language. It's produced from Khari Bawali, and the way it is written, it is obviously, it suggests that it is the product of a mind of a person who is not really well versed in Hindi. Could we have the next, please, Ravi Khan? Shall I just carry on, and then we can show the illustrations later on. Can we get another one, Ravi Khan? Can you hear me? Okay, I'll just carry on. Can people hear me? Just nod your head, one of you at least. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. There is some. Ravi Khan, can you get that image that you flashed the first, and I'll just talk about it.
So we are trying to do that. Actually, we are all stuck with some technical issues. That's why it's taking some time.
Okay, then perhaps I should just keep quiet so that, and wait for the image to come, because oh God.
Or sir, maybe if you are comfortable, then we can proceed further, and then we can get back to those images, whatever suits you.
Well, I'm not comfortable, as you can see, because I'm coughing my lung out now. But the thing is that I was, all right, so I'll just invert. We'll come to the image, images that I was going to refer to. One thing that emerges interestingly is that there is a re-referencing of very well-known episodes of mythology or of religious presentation, and transposing it onto the nationalist. Now, there is a well-known story of Markandeya, the little child who is a great devotee of Shiva, and Yam tries to come and reclaim him, and Markandeya then hangs on to the iconic image of Shiva, and Yam has to really acquiesce and retreat so that Markandeya can carry on being a very devoted devotee, shall we say, of Shiva. Now that's an image that I'm talking about, because there is a proscribed picture which translates the Markandeya story into a Gandhian movement. It's not Shiva but Gandhi who is blessing, and there's a woman who is tied to Yama through the Partantrata ki Lassi, and Yama is trying to lead, which is Angrezi Raj, lead the woman away, but she stands her ground, and this was prescribed because the colonial administration at the UP level, through its Indian subordinates, was able to fathom that this is a subversive way of utilizing and quote unquote exploiting a religious myth, story, or image onto a new dimension. Now, I want to talk about one other image. I wish we had just stayed with it, which was the first image that Ravi Khan flashed through. But I'll come to that towards the end. So let me carry on with my argument. That's basically one point that I want to really emphasize is, which gets connected to what I was saying earlier on, that these poems are written by nationalists who obviously are constituted in their consciousness not by an empty idea of nationalist being. They are nationalists, but also upper caste males. Now, what is interesting, we should never forget about it, because we sometimes get so focused on the actual message that we often lose how the structure of Indian society or attitudes towards women or Dalit is also being reflected, as it must, in these purely nationalist, here it is, imagery. But I'll come to that later on. But here is the very interesting picture, which is called Swaraj Ki Ladai. And it is a picture of militant mobilization. This is by one Prabhu Dayal, and it's published by a professional picture merchant. It says, produced by Shyam Sundar Lal, picture merchant, Chowk, Kanpur. It purports to paint a realist picture of the state of the country during the civil disobedience movement of 1932. It opens a page, and that's how the picture is, opens a page from Ramayana, and it titles it Bharat Kand. On one page to the left, Gandhi is portrayed, his kutia hut in the background, and Gandhi is wielding the charkha in a defensive posture. Standing next to him is a satyagrahi, head bent in peaceful pose, about to be clobbered by a policeman crossing over from the side of state power, right-hand side of the page, onto this page symbolically occupied by Gandhi and Nehru. Nehru, interestingly, peculiarly, is portrayed in a somewhat comical avatar of Hanuman, flying in with the Sanjeevani Booty Parvat in one hand and the mace or boycott of English goods in another. Nehru's, in this image of Nehru, its landing site is not a comatose Lakshman who has to be revived with Sanjeevani Booty, but Sita, personified as Azadi, sitting forlornly under a date palm tree, which is peculiar because the date palm tree is normally an Islamic symbol. The bulk of the page has Azadi, literally cornered by an Englishman, Raman, not a 10-headed Dashanan, but a solar topi wearing multi-armed 15 in number creature. Each arm designating such instruments of colonial rule as Rai Bahaduri, forge, the might of the sword, handcuffs, ordinance, Criminal Law Amendment Act Section 144, 124A, magistracy, cavalry, police, jail, and so on. So these 15 arms of the state of this new Raman are really arms that are aspects of oppressive colonial rule. On top of this, on counterposing the succor bringing Hanuman Nehru, we have a tiger moth hovering over the top of the page, this plane, occupied by colonial state structure. To locate the picture in space and time is the Qutub Minar and the Imperial Legislative Assembly, in a word, the colonial state, as had been recently ensconced at New Delhi. Now, piquant and overbearing in its topoi, when transmuted into verse, such picturesque exhortation as the one depicting Nehru as Hanuman could be equally forced. Witness this compilation quite widespread between Gandhi and Krishna. I have the Hindi text, but I'm just, for easy communication, giving you a very, very rough translation, which really takes away from the pungency of the Hindi verse. He played a mellifluous flute, this one deftly charkha plies. He polished off cow's milk, this one favors bakri milk. He had gwalas for companions, now he enlists volunteers. He was known as the butter thief, this one goes by the name of Namak Chor, the salt baron. So that's one point I wanted to make about how well-known imageries and well-known stories from the broadly religious spheres are transmuted and transformed onto portrayal in print of the situation of colonial rule. Now, the last move that I want to make, which refers back while we're waiting for this photograph, to the point I was making, that these poems, nationalists, are not in an empty homogenizing sense of the word nationalist. These are written by nationalist males, and basically from a casteist society that is North India. And I'll just make that point as the last point by picking up on two points of this story of casteist and sexist writings within nationalist poetry. There is obviously the question of temperance, the giving up of liquor, which is central to the Gandhian program of 1920. So there are poems written in a very popular Bhojpuri mode on Shrabava or Nisha Bajava, the drunkard. And it says various things that, you get drunk and you puke in the street, you don't take care of your wife, you've lost, total control over your body body functions, etc. But there's a very interesting last line, which says, and I'm not going to use the casteist words that they use, I'll just let the letters speak for them. D and C, scavengers and leather workers, sab madira banawatare, tavana ke pike har khail nisha bajava. Actually, it's not correct that these lowest castes were fermenting liquor. There's another caste that does. But the implication is that these are activities that are confined to the lowest of the low, and you, the drunkard, who belongs to another social category, a higher social category, you are now equating yourself with these lowly people who are part of the nation, whom Gandhi is trying to mobilize as well. The last point, which is about this most iconic of Gandhian imagery, which is charkha and khaddar. Now, again, it's interesting that Charkha, well, Gandhi himself, this point needs stressing, while Gandhi himself does the remarkable thing as a male of actually plying the charkha all the time. Charkha, as we know, is basically a womanly activity. In India, also spinning was a woman's activity in England, hence the word spinster. Here, popular, generally known as somebody who's single and doesn't marry, but the term really originates from the activity of women spinning. So there's a lot on charkha, and charkha means women. And women, when you talk about women, upper caste males, there is a sense of lasciviousness, of sensuality, and high caste attitudes that comes in. And in fact, one poem is actually very categorically addressed to, quote unquote, the prostitutes. Says, हुक्म गांधी का सराखों से बजाना होगा, तुमको भी अब चरखा चलाना होगा. And it has such lines as which kind of titillate male fantasy as लेवेंडर सेंट की जगह मेरी परी रूवो, इत्र देसी ही तुम्हें मलना मलाना होगा. स्वराज चलाओ चरखा तो घर बैठे होम रूल मिले, स्वराज लेने तुम्हें दूर न जाना होगा. So actually, this is actually in its own way emphasizing spinning, but the language and the sentiments through which it articulates this idea, are reflective of social and sexist attitudes in our society. The last point, of course, is about Khaddar. And again, there are n number of poems that emphasize women really now yearning for saris and phariya, which is short skirt worn by girls, saying, I don't want the fine textured mill-made or European-made sari, I want the rough one. So that is the central message, that we are trying to weave women from wearing machine-made saris and even from cloth imported from the outside by homespun Khaddar saris. But even this noble desire is still not devoid and very much present, in fact, of male voyeuristic attitudes and tendency. So there is as I said, phariya is a small skirt worn by small girls. So that attitude is also present even when talking about girls speaking about themselves. मैं तो जहर मरूंगी खाए मंगा दे फरिया गाढ़े की. The girl saying, I'll kill myself, but I want fariya of gadha, which is the Khaddar. And then the rest of the poem, after this initial move, is really filled with titillating imagery of the girl saying, I don't want this thin, diaphanous fariya because, it's really a see-through. I don't want this very, very slippery cloth because it kind of almost slips off. I want the sturdy, hard Khaddar. So that, we get what I'm arguing for, that obviously the overarching theme is of anti-British poetry and pamphlets which are proscribed. But the prescription is of pamphlets which are authored by one section of the Indian population. I'm talking about North India, middle caste, upper caste males in their 20s and 30s. And there is no way, in fact, unless you purge yourself totally of these innate attitudes. And in some ways, that is Gandhi's ultimate aim, to decast oneself, to get rid of the ideas that one is born with and one grows with. Now, unless you do away with that, which is a very, very difficult thing to do, nationalist poetry of the most incendiary, of the most revolutionary, a poetry that is aimed at mobilization, leaves behind for us signs of the people, status, and subject position of those who write it. So nationalism doesn't, at a broad level, doesn't wipe off all the differences that Indian society has. In fact, even in its attempt to be purely nationalist, it shows a lot of itself to ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shahid Amin. For this guidance, and we are really apologetic for the glitches. We could not show all the clips, but because there was network connection coming in and going out, and so we will show these images at some point of time. Divya, you want to, Professor Shahid Amin, there is no Q&A after this keynote. So thanks a lot. In spite of not feeling too well, you accepted our invitation and addressed us. Thanks a lot, Professor Shahid Amin. Divya, are you there?
Yes, sir. I would also like to extend my thanks to Professor Shahid Amin for his wonderful
Is your
insights
mic
into
working?
the... Yes, sir. Am I audible? I think it's working. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes,
Sir,
I can hear you.
okay. So, sir, I just wanted to thank you for your amazing insights into the idea of subversion,
So shall
the
we
ideas
proceed?
and...
Let Divya speak.
Am I audible? Because I
Yes.
am just getting confused. Yes, sir. So I was just extending my thanks for dealing into the ideas and emotions that fueled such writings which were proscribed, and the literary translation of those intent that were there in those writings, the nuances of the imagery, symbolicism into the pamphlets that portrayed the disparities within the nationalist ideas. Because since I am also a student of history, we normally see under this umbrella term of nationalism, all these nuances get ignored at times. So thank you for pointing out, and thank you for taking time for us despite such bad throat. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Divya, and thank you, Ravi Khan, and thanks everyone very much.
Uh, Ravi sir, should we move ahead?
You want to introduce our next set of speakers?
Yes, sir. Yes, I can do that.
Please move ahead with the permission of the chair.
Okay, so moving on. Now I would like to invite our next esteemed speaker, Professor Wendy Singer. Professor Wendy Singer is the Roy Wortman Professor, History and Director of Asian and Middle East Studies at Kenyon College in United States. She teaches modern Indian history. Her books include A Constituency Suitable for Ladies, A Social History of Women and Elections, and Independent India, which tells history through literature, art, politics, and social movements. Her earlier work was on oral narratives and rural politics in Bihar in the 1930s, as reflected in Creating Histories, Oral Narratives, and the Politics of History Making. It was for this project that Professor Singer first encountered the proscribed pamphlets collection at the British Library and began to see the importance of interactions between oral and written sources. All of these projects share a deep interest in the history of Indian democracy, even especially as it challenged the British colonial state. She has followed this inquiry to Chennai to study the long history of the Madras Municipal Council. Some of this recent comparative research between Bihar and Madras has appeared in the journal South Asia, the Election Law Journal, and in several edited volumes. We welcome you, Professor Wendy Singer. Thank you for joining us. Over to you now.
Thank you so much. Can I share screen?
Yes, ma'am. Please go ahead.
Share a window. Yeah. Oh, there it is. Well, thank you, everyone. And I want to thank the organizers of this conference. This is such an important conversation to be having. I've already appreciated the keynotes and comments that came before. And I've had a long conversation over many years with Shahid Amin, and you'll hear some commonalities between some of the issues that he raised as I go on. On a light note, it is now 1:30 a.m. Where I am, so it's still dark outside. And in that darkness, it's nice to have the enlightenment of these conversations about prescribed pamphlets and banned material. The basis of my talk today is a particular collection of banned material that's made up of song lyrics, flyers, and pamphlets from the early 20th century. I will address the ironies of trying to ban material that was oral.
Excuse me, ma'am. Quite disturbed. Voice is coming. No, you're.
Should I? Is there? Can you hear me?
Please.
Yeah, Professor Wendy, continue, please.
Yeah. Okay. Just wanted to make sure that there wasn't a problem. Okay. Thanks. Let's see where. Yes. So I want to talk about these prescribed pamphlets, especially as they relate to oral narratives that I collected also at about the same time that I first encountered these. And actually, one of the main issues that I want to address is that more people should be using these materials. Some of them are at the British Library, others in the National Archive. And yes, they're in many languages, and some of the languages are ones I don't know. And so it would be wonderful to have more commentary on the Telugu and Malayali and other materials. So let me turn to some specific examples of ways in which I found these powerful materials. And I'm going to start with one of them, which was a pamphlet that I saw many years ago called The Autobiography of Kadi. It's a 1922 compilation of political songs and commentary from Bihar. A singer both calls upon and mocks Le Chailaba, which is in Bihari Hindi, a young man, but usually a kind-hearted young man. The singer also in this song shifts gender as the song progresses. But central to the song is a lesson about the importance of Kadi as a political symbol of Indian nationalism. A part of the song goes, the Videshi writes, "Remember me and forget me not, Re Chailaba, still you don't understand. The beautiful foreign sari brings you curses, wearing foreign pants, claiming a national, and yet claiming a nationalist heart. Foreign goods are shameful, like a prostitute or Randi. Hear Gandhi Baba's call, Re Chailaba." This Hindi Maithili song, and the songs were both in Hindi and Maithili in this case. This one was labeled HINB 763 in the British Library's collection. And it's literally a compilation made up of bits and pieces drawn together in various order. One interesting thing in this song is the way in which it addresses its target of the narrative in ways as the poem goes along, sometimes coaxing and sometimes chastising. This songbook is one of many similar documents I photocopied in the British Library in 1985 and 1986. when I was first studying the peasant movements in India and Bihar in the 1920s and 30s. It is an ideal example of the kinds of publications that emerged in rural Bihar at the time. Small towns developed printing presses that produced not only nationalist literature, but religious tracts, autobiographies, family histories, and flyers that were distributed in order to call people to meetings. One local activist described it this way. So even though these pamphlets were banned, that didn't stop their production. As one activist explained it, we snuck into fields of sugarcane when the sugarcane was high with a mimeograph machine and produced material at night with just the light of the moon, or when we thought no one was able to see us, we used a lantern. In this essay, I examined the important British Library's collection known as Proscribed pamphlets to discuss their value in rethinking sources of history making. Copies of these are also available in the National Archive, some of the same pamphlets I saw later on in Delhi. With time to reflect on this material long after I first encountered it, I see its significance in three specific ways. First of all, especially since much of this material is made up of songbooks and poems, it allows us to talk about the relationship between oral and written sources of the past. Secondly, it sheds a different light on political resistance movements, showing what forms of political material the British government considered important enough to ban, and what movements seemed a particular threat to the British. And finally, a collection that contains material in multiple languages opens up important possibilities for comparing what would usually be considered local history across geographic regions of India. And so since I've been studying Tamil, I've begun to be able to make some comparisons. Rethinking research I began in 1986. This paper shows the multi-directional flow and ongoing translation of oral and written sources, which both served as forms of protest and as sources of history. Often common themes ran through these materials that reveal what rhetoric of political resistance was most resonant across time and space. One example I will use here today is this idea of shamefulness that ran through a number of these songs and pamphlets. And I think that, and I'm just going to use that as one example as a way to dive in more deeply to this material. Encountering proscribed pamphlets. In the mid-1980s, I collected songs of political resistance from written sources like the autobiography of Khadi, and from people who sang them for me in villages in Bihar. At the time, I was writing a dissertation on peasant movements in the region of Mithila in North Bihar. In the process, I both worked in archives in Darbhanga, Patna, and Delhi, and collected a range of oral material. I learned many songs by heart and continued to talk to people about their content and their uses and the mechanisms through which they were transmitted. Interestingly, this particular song did not make it into my dissertation or my first book, Creating Histories. This shows, however, how much rich material there was, that not everything could be included. One critical issue that I discovered in the course of this research was how different kinds of songs were associated with different political movements in the countryside. The archive placed them in categories based on languages, but I found it more important to disaggregate them based on the movements they represented. Some songs clearly were generated by peasant and labor movements. These often had socialist and communist influences about the Red Revolution or Workers United. Others were associated with the freedom movement more generally and focused on nationalism. Later songs addressed the Maithili language movement, advocating that Maithil be added to the 8th schedule of India's constitution. When I found songs in written pamphlets from the British Library, like other written sources, I took them along to Bihar to ask people about them. In this group, the songs that resonated most with women I interviewed were songs about Khadi and the social reform movement. Women's participation in spinning Khadi thread and picketing foreign cloth stores were resonant in this song, as an example. What is remarkable about the collection of prescribed materials in the British Library is the breadth of the sources, genre, and languages represented. At about the same time I reached the India Office Library and Record Room, these materials were being cataloged by Graham Shaw and Mary Lloyd, who were among the archivists that had published an article and bibliography of these materials. The collection contains more than 1,600 documents, including everything from small books to single-page leaflets, and they included at least 15 South Asian languages. The pamphlets were cataloged and labeled by those languages. However, material in regional languages like Maithili were often incorporated in the Hindi list. What is remarkable about the collection is its breadth. The government banned materials mostly based on the Indian Press Act of 1910, which singled out as seditious anything that showed antagonism to the British government, and also banned items that they perceived might fuel religious strife. But many of the songs and pamphlets from peasant movements were not included in these materials. So I found a lot of pamphlets in the countryside even still that people had kept that were very radical, but not included in these banned materials. A large part of the collection contained nationalist poetry, and we heard some of that earlier. This reflected both the increase in circulation of such materials after World War I and the non-cooperation movement. The Bihar pamphlets I collected mostly fit into that category. Since I was already interested in songs before I came to the India Office Library in 1985, my first surprise upon seeing the written record was how similar the material was to songs I'd already heard. An important lesson then was that banning songbooks, of course, did not stop the circulation of songs themselves, that oral material continues to be sung and shared. And when I took the songbooks back to the countryside, people recognized many of those same songs. And so while the songbooks sometimes had an author attached to them, people didn't necessarily attribute them to anybody in particular. Indeed, this is an irony about the longevity of ephemeral material. Though produced on flimsy paper and in small batches not meant to last, their content indeed survived. Pamphlets confiscated by the colonial government lived on in public record, and the songs themselves were preserved in private lives. But many of those people are no longer alive to sing those songs. So having this written record enriches our historical, here are some of those pamphlets, but enriches our historical evidence. And I show this as an example from the same region, but a lot of ephemeral material is still being produced. And here's a Madhubani painting that's from a protest against dowry. So all of these materials fit into a larger world of ephemeral political work. So now let me look at some very specific examples and talk about the ways in which these materials worked. The songs that appeared in the archives often came from the Khadi movement, and Khadi centers were surely sites of sedition. People understood what they were doing as nationalism. At the same time, Khadi production became part of the rural economy, from women spinners to young boys who collected the thread and took them to male weavers at these central locations. And as they worked, either the spinners or the weavers, they surely sang songs that were sometimes songs of protest, but were part of their daily rituals. Some were jhumar, some were ghazals, some were bhajans, and these became mixed together as new words were put to them in different contexts. Let me talk a little bit about the sad story of Khadi, which is another pamphlet in addition to the autobiography of Khadi. So yes, a lot of these were about Khadi. It seemed that the Khadi movement, I think because of Gandhi's connection to it, was one of the preoccupations for the British to ban those particular songs. In the Ray Chalaba song, as you go through the song, I can go back to it actually. You can see that the person being addressed changes in gender. So the kind-hearted bystander is accused of wearing ostentatious saris in one line and foreign trousers in another. Such pamphlets and poems, and the poems they contained, were part of a conscious creation of written record, happening on the spot of local political expression. They also served as a means of organizing. People passed pamphlets around from one village to another. This one has an author on the first page, Brinda Prasad Varma, also called Prem. His pen name is repeated in several poems, including a ghazal at the end of the booklet. The site of publication listed on the pamphlet is Darbhanga town in North Bihar. Darbhanga was designated as the district in colonial Bihar. It was also a market town and the headquarters of the zamindari of the Maharaja of Darbhanga. The Maharaja had his residence there, and the town expanded considerably from 1919 to 1935 when many of these pamphlets were being produced. Some of the parts of this Ray Chalaba poem also resonated with songs that people sang that were not directly this song. This Jhumar is also given a little preface criticizing the nature of imperialism and the imperial system. And this little preface says, depending on someone brings destruction. It will cut at the basis of our lives. Then what follows are 8 couplets, each ending in Ray Chalaba. So there's also a kind of nod to a ghazal, even though it doesn't quite fit into that pattern. The theme of shamefulness of foreign cloth resonated with other songs of the time. For example, when I asked women to sing Khadi songs for me, they often included a reference to morality. For example, another song goes like this, and this definitely reminded me of something that Shahid Amin said. I will not wear foreign cloth, the words of my darling call out. I will fight rather than give in. Because wearing such a thing in the Ganges to bathe, when I emerge from the Ganges, my body will show shamefully. I heard this song originally in Maithili in North Bihar, but I talked to people who knew other versions of it in Magahi and South Bihar as well. In this way, songs traveled. And interestingly, the Ganges flows through central Bihar, and so it had perhaps more literal resonance when sung there. Like Ray Chalaba, the Ganges song also has an interesting gender complexity. Although I heard it from women who described it as a women's singing, a spinning song, the narrator is a man who's saying the words of my darling or my sweetheart, implying a woman, call out. Of course, people often sing the parts of others in folk songs, so this is not necessarily unusual. But in this case, the gender inversion coincided with the practices of the Khadi movement, in which women did take on male roles in protests, and men took on women's roles in spinning. Some upper class and upper caste women described political marches as the first time they'd gone out into the streets, marching and singing for social and political reform. This was clear in one of the very important aspects of the Khadi movement, not only making their own cloth, but picketing foreign cloth stores and often at the same time liquor stores. So that was a way in which women found a kind of freedom of movement that was being encouraged by nationalism. But the local nature of songs tied to regional languages did not mean that political activism was localized. Rather, similar actions took place across India in ways that were expressed in local idioms. For example, in 1932, women marching against foreign cloth store in Madras were sprayed with water hoses as the police tried to quell dissent in 1932. The commonality between these protests and similar events in North India are obvious. Like the Bihari examples, the Madras story is a local one. It came to light in the Madras Municipal Council meeting when council members took on the commissioner of police and the commissioner of the Madras Municipal Corporation. The issue of contention was that the police had stolen a water van that was owned by the corporation, and Indians who were in charge of the corporation said that this was an illegal use of the water van. What is strikingly similar to the language in the Khadi songs collected from Bihar are the connection between foreign cloth, women's workers, and the morality of issue of attached to water. Here, the river, not the Ganges, but the Kovam, is cited as a symbol of pollution and defilement. The Madras incident highlighted the idea that the police may have used dirty water to defile women protesters. What water is this? A counselor asks. And another one says, are they using colored water or drainage water? Hanan Angelo, the only woman in the council, then responded, may I know if they're using filtered water or the polluted water from the Kovam River? So in this way, they are echoing some of the same narratives that exist in those spinning songs. The immoral actions of the government, the aggression of the police, and the government's violation of its own rules of separate powers for Indians became expressed in the same terms of shamefulness. The continuum of the Khadi movement was spinning, which women could even do at home, to Khadi, and then that same thread was sent to Khadi centers, connecting women's work to men's work in the same political movements. In oral narratives, the Khadi movement was often described as part of a larger social reform movement and often associated with a kind of conservative politics in the countryside, as opposed to more radical labor organizing or peasant movements. And so it is ironic that these were the ones that the British thought of as the greater threat, and certainly for banning. The Ray Chalaba song makes explicit references to British rule and colonialism as part of its own moral lesson. The Videshi foreigner writes, remember me, forget me not, and hurled curses at us and take our wealth. Other songs were more pointed in their bitter and threatening language. While Ray Chalaba was a kind of light feel and reference to setting it to a jhumar, to dance music, underscores the lightness of that song. By contrast, a more haunting song from another proscribed pamphlet powerfully invokes the colonial inequality. This pamphlet, titled ironically or intentionally, Beloved Songs of the Countryside. And I thought this was interesting in reference to what some of the titles that Shahid was talking about that were more subversive. But this pamphlet was called Beloved Songs of the Countryside. And one of them was about what imperialism meant in very powerful terms. Oh, Ram, I don't like the flute of these white people. They take our rice, they take our air, they take our cotton, and what do they give us? 2 metal needles. They take away the gold, they take away the silver, they take away every paisa, and what do they give? A single piece of tin. They take away each female goat, they take away each male goat, they take away all the eggs, and in exchange, what do they give? A flag made of paper. This song gives prominence to the inequality of economics of imperialism. Indians provide cotton, gold, and silver while receiving goods of much less value. The final image of the paper janda, kagas ka ek janda, presents multiple metaphors. The flag of paper might indicate the bankruptcy of imperialism, propelling nationalists toward a flag of independence. Or it could mean that the British had provided only flags of empire, not the protection wealth it promised. And in this particular pamphlet, you see the flags and with the charkha on it and Mother India. So perhaps the replacement of the charkha flag for the paper flag that the British are promising. Finally, the Ray Chalaba song also offers our kind-hearted but unmindful young man some redemption through Khadi. It ends, but wearing Khadi will reform us, Ray Chalaba. Hear Gandhi Baba's call, Ray Chalaba. Stop wearing foreign pants and claiming a nationalist heart. Through tears of love, we see our country now. So let me conclude. What these examples show is how the Proscribed pamphlets collection bridged a gap between oral history and written sources. Recording songs and producing flyers was itself an act of politics, providing something to share and publicize protests. And this was not lost on British officials who readily banned the material evidence of organizing. What the study of the Khadi movement in Bihar shows is that banning oral material did not destroy it. The written documents of Khadi songs did enhance the study of the songs themselves. And as we as historians can collect material that was once banned, we can add it to oral evidence and other evidence from the countryside to get a more pointed example of local history. A movement that was especially important to women did not often produce arrests, did not readily produce written records of its own, court records, police files, etc. Interestingly, although the Khadi pamphlets in the archives were often recorded by men and written by men, as Shahid pointed out, the songs that contained in them were very often women's songs. It was the combination of oral sources on the ground and oral sources in the archive that best elaborate the significance of the Khadi movement for reasons that were not necessarily nationalism. Also for women's ability to get out of the house, to become part of a larger process, to gain some. In fact, women spinners also could make some money from their spinning. A lot of widows were spinners during the nationalist movement. A comparison across regions suggested here is just one way in which the Proscribed pamphlets allow us to do a kind of history that local history alone can't tell us. It also hints at another larger conclusion. By banning certain kinds of rhetoric, we see what the British government saw as a threat. The Khadi songs were one of those threats, showing the power not only of the movement, but of how it was transmitted through song. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Singer. Thank you so much for taking us through the journey of data collection through this project and introducing us to the available sources, and also for pointing out the importance and longevity of oral sources when it comes to studying the history of colonial India from we popularly call as Worm's view perspective. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
you. Since we are on a very tight schedule, I would like to ask Ravi sir, do we have time for Q&A, or should I call upon our next?
I think there should be some questions. Please open the floor.
Okay, so I'm opening the floor. If there are any questions, we'll quickly take 2-3 questions and then move ahead with the next speaker. So are there any questions?
Okay, let me, Professor Singer, thank you so much. It flows nicely from Shahid's address earlier. And what is remarkable from our point of view is that your observation that, banning does not mean destruction of the material. It lives on in memory and performance. And it lives on also in the autobiographies of, I was reading something like a text written by Yashpal, who was one of the revolutionaries with Bhagat Singh and others. And he mentions there are several plays that HSRA and this group actually plays around Mahabharat that they actually remodeled and rewrote. The plays of Parsi theatre, for example, from Parsi theatre, that they rewrote and actually performed. So it's a wonderful journey, and there's no one-way journey that from oral it goes to print. Rather, it can go on from print to the oral, and there are various slippages. This cat and mouse game between the between colonial control and the nationalist subversion, as it were. I was curious about this, the original title of Atmakatha, Khadi ki Atmakatha. Is it called Atmakatha, autobiography, or something else?
No, it is called Atmakatha. And there was also another one that was called The Sad Story of Khadi. And I mean, there are numbers of them, but that particular pamphlet, which I happen to have right here on my desk, it was called Atmakatha.
Right. The other thing is, your talk
And what's
tells us,
useful about
I
that is
think,
that that's
a remarkable
also
thing is that there are limits to colonial control, right? Not everything could be actually banned and or proscribed or even snatched away. So there are limits. You could not reach out to every subversive act of print or performance. So that's another. Thanks a lot. One would like to read you more and about these forms of ghazals and bhajans and qawwalis. But very nice to know this is the first paper I have heard about proscription, about proscribed literature performance in Bihar, in Mithilanchal, etc., etc. Some of us do belong there. So thanks a lot for your wonderful paper.
I just wanted to say one more thing, and that is the circulation of these is critical. That Khadi was considered dangerous and prescribed, but the circulation of this material went way beyond just Khadi songs.
Any other questions?
Ravi Khan. Ravi Khan?
Chat box. Aparna Vaidik writes,
Yeah,
and this is for Amin Saab. We have not done any Q&A, but I mean, we can discuss it. Professor Singer can come on this. And Shahid, if you are still there,
I've come
you
to
say that the pamphlets were produced by upper caste men who may not have been well versed in Hindi, and that these pamphlets were casteist and sexist. Would they have been less so if the men were upper class and well educated?
Hey, that's a very, very fine distinction that is best left to politicians, non-academics. Obviously it was a way of saying that these are not your, they are very, very well-known poets. The poetry is not, all that great. That's what I meant. I'm not saying that if there was somebody with a PhD degree and casteist and sexist, he would have written a better poetry. No, that was not, it's just that it's a reading based on a large survey of the material. But what I was trying to do is point out that very often these are taken as examples of nationalist outpouring, without actually flagging, not necessarily in terms of the name, and parentage of one who wrote, but in the discursive world, that it shows. So perhaps you might have the rare example of somebody who was not casteist, still writing in a particular way. And I'm not saying that everything flows from your subject position, but I was trying to suggest that it's very difficult not to be struck by the constant manner in which fissures and attitudes within North Indian society, surface quite prominently in something that's supposed to be broadly ideological, which is supposed to subsume differences within a broad emerging nationalist public. So Aparna, that's what I was trying to argue, because normally and I'm so glad that Wendy is here, and we have been in conversation now for a very, very long time. Though I don't come from Bihar, Ravi Khan, but I'm on the cusp of Bihar. After me, Bihar, as they say. But
you can be an honorary Bihari.
Sure. After me, Bihar. Sorry. So, oh my God. So what I'm trying to say is that if normally, even I we looked at this material as evidence, to tag on to what we learned from Home Political File or a CID report. I was trying to, just as a preliminary exercise, try to look at it not more than as evidence of so many pamphlets being written on Khadi, right? That our nationalist outpouring was so great, and that the colonial state was, Wendy suggested that, and that's true, was very, especially on the lookout for Khadi. Though, Wendy, I'm not too sure that there was this kind of a nationalist ire, shall we say, directed at Khadi, because it didn't really, it in some ways was not considered that political from people in authority. Though while it was construed as very innovative, and the language of Khadi and Charkha really permeated in wide areas. In my Gandhi piece, I do refer to people, which castes punished delinquents by ordering them to get so many charkhas fabricated. So there is a way in which Charkha is a language that permits more so within a growing nationalist public than something that the colonial state is really concerned to ban the moment it comes through. The fact that there is so much of banned material to do with Charkha is also because so much of stuff was banned, and also because I have a feeling that a lot of these poems were not single title poems. They would be part of a Sangeet Mala or something, and we are able to pick it up, the Khadi poems. But that's a point that worth considering, that it's very difficult to establish that unless there is a noting in a record that perhaps in a collection of poems it was one particularly offensive quote unquote poem that led to the entire collection being proscribed and therefore available to Wendy and me at the British Library and the National Archives. So that I think it would, those of us who are now more concerned to look at this textually rather than only at evidentiary.
Yeah, I agree.
So that if you look at the earlier work of some of my colleagues, say Gyan Pandey even, right? So the 1930s, this is evidence that you pick up, which it is a bit evidence, of course, but it also allows you to tell a story which is about Indian society more generally. And so to that extent, meaning I've not established that person to person by caste names and so on, it is a fair assumption to say that these are not really low caste, newly literate people writing. Perhaps there are some of them. And one last thing, Wendy, is that it's also interesting that some of these songs are actually written by people who sign themselves as Khajuriwala. I mean, somebody who plays, the Khajuri. And as you know, this kind of a single-handed drum does emerge as a sign of resistance in a lot of popular movements today. It's not simple people simple singing, but to the beat of the Khajuri, so that there are people who are writing it for it to be sung. So thank you, Aparna. That made me think a bit more about it. But my basic point was that this is an archive that can be explored in all sorts of ways. So nationalism, the nationalist rubric doesn't kind of lead to a closure in how we read it.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd want to add to that is that you're absolutely right that but whose name is on the pamphlet might not have been necessarily who wrote the song or who sang the song or who produced the song or who made it up. So you're right that the archive tells us one thing, but the songs may be from other places.
But there's also the issue of printing. In fact, One of the pamphlets that I was going to put up is actually stressing its copyright. That, you know, इज्जत को समझ के, मान को समझ के इसको copy करना. So that there is a way in which print, the fact that it's been printed, also leads to it really following in some ways the notion of copyright.
I agree. And also a kind of prestige that you got it printed.
Sorry, I think we'll just stop. We've been talking too much to each other. But thank you, Aparna.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Shahid. Thank you, Professor Singer. And we actually very much enjoyed the further delving into the ideas that were earlier discussed. Thank you so much. Moving on.
Thank you.
Let's move on.
Moving on, now I would like to invite our next keynote speaker, Professor Mini Chandran. She would be speaking on Liberally Illiberal, the Nature of Proscription in British India. Professor Mini Chandran is a professor of English at IIT Kanpur. Her areas of interest are literature and censorship, Indian literature and aesthetics, and translation studies. She has published articles in academic journals as well as newspapers, and is the author of The Writer, The Reader, and the State, Literary Censorship in India, and co-author of An Introduction to Indian Aesthetics, History, Theory, Theoreticians. I welcome you, Professor Mini Chandran. Thank you for joining us. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you for that introduction, Divya. And after these wonderful presentations by both Professor Shahid Amin and Professor Singer, I am actually focusing on print rather than the oral tradition. So again, please allow me to share my slides. Just a second, I don't know. Yeah, I hope my slides are visible.
Yes, ma'am, it's visible now.
Yeah, okay. So what I'm going to basically speak about is the nature of prescription in British India, some of the ambiguities, the contradictions that we see within the policy of the British censorship. So I want to start, it's a rather chronological journey that I'm trying to trace, but I'm beginning in a rather asynchronic mode. So I want to talk about a particular point in the history of colonial India, which is 1905, when Lord Minto took over as the office of Viceroy of India after Lord Curzon. So Lord Minto inherited a mutinous country that was hostile to the colonial master and necessitated unequivocal use of force. At the same time, India Office in London received a new head, who was the liberal John Morley. Minto and Morley had to work in close association with each other in the administration of the colony. But the two could not generally agree on crucial matters like censorship, because Morley the liberal was usually did not allow him to implement extreme measures like rigid controls over press and literature in India, whereas Minto, who was extremely cautious and susceptible to even a murmur of criticism in the native press, and found it difficult to govern this country, found it very difficult to follow the liberalist impulses of Morley. So what I'm using this as a sort of model, because caught between these liberalist impulses and the caught between the liberalist impulses in theory and the practical necessity of governing the country, the policy swung from repression and tolerance. So Gerald Barrier, who has written about this nature of political control in India, says this: caught between a tradition that favored a free press and anxiety overall, but the most innocuous criticism, the British swung back and forth from strict controls to virtual freedom of expression. Now, here I think I should possibly explain the title of my talk, which is Liberally Illiberal, What I mean to say is not that the British were very liberal, but that the illiberalism was tempered by a lot of liberal impulses. Right? So, if we look at the beginnings of censorship, the British had been a dominant force in India for over a century before they thought it important to track and control the production and distribution of printed material in India, which was by the late 18th century. This point gains in significance when we consider that printing had started in 1556 in India, when the Portuguese established the first printing press in Tranquebar. Till the late 18th century, which is marked by the first instances of colonial censorship, the British did not consider the journalistic or literary creations of India a threat to the power they were seeking to consolidate. Now, one possible reason could be that they thought that most of the literature that was produced in India was of a religious nature. That is one possibility. The other possibility could be that the East India Company, which is what it was at that point of time, had rather mercantile interests rather than political ambitions. So these could be the two possible reasons. But if you look at the history of censorship in India, perhaps you can identify two turning points. One is the Battle of Plassey in 1757, and the second is the 1857, what is called the Sepoy Mutiny by the British, and what we call as the First War of Indian Independence. So one of the first victims of the attempt to control and suppress, which was the policy that was adopted by the British after 1757, was an Englishman himself, or rather an Irishman, who was James Augustus Hickey, who was the editor of the Bengal Gazette, or it's more popularly known as Hickey's Gazette. Hickey's Gazette was more of a gossip rag, basically. And in fact, Hickey made the mistake of writing something rather scandalous about Hastings' wife. And of course, Hastings was not very pleased about it. And he became too satirical and mocking for the comfort of Governor General Warren Hastings. Hickey was deported and Hickey's Gazette was impounded. 1799, you have Lord Wellesley, who was imposing a system of pre-censorship. So from this point onwards, we find that printing presses required licenses. So if you think of it, the censorship system that was in place was a combination of coercive measures like licensing and pre-publication review, and also punitive measures like imprisonment or deportment or imposing fines. But what we find interesting about this period is that this is not a period of uniform control. The laws were relaxed somewhat till 1818. But in 1823, you have an ordinance passed by Governor General John Adam, which reiterated the government's right to control all printed material, that is in the form of licenses, and the requirement of all printed material to be subject to a pre-publication review. In 1835, again, we have the very famous minute by Macaulay, and it is, of course, Macaulay was rather critical of the material that was produced in India, and he hoped that the creation of a class of English-speaking natives would solve a major part of the problems of the empire, and he brought about, or he wanted, rigorous censorship to be imposed. But you see, it's an irony, which has already been pointed out by both Professor Singer and Professor Rami, that literature has a tendency to slip through the nets. So despite this very rigorous censorship and this attempt to completely stifle native voices, we find that there was a sort of subterranean net of literature that operated against the empire, culminating in the 1857 mutiny or the War of Independence. But what we generally see here is a sort of seesaw of relaxation and control. And this is a pattern that we see repeated till 1947. It's understandable that after 1857, controls over the press intensified because the perception of the British was that the the parallel world of literature or the parallel underground of literature contributed in a major way to the political movement or this violent uprising of 1857. So in 1857, you have the passing of the Licensing Act, which was also called the Gagging Act, which is very revelatory. The title itself tells you what the act or the effect that the act had in practice. So the government held the right to grant and revoke licenses according to this act. Macaulay had drafted a criminal law, and this became formally the Indian Penal Code in 1860. Another impact of the 1857 war was the systematization and intensification of regulatory measures. So what had till then been rather haphazard, from 1860 or after 1857, it becomes much more methodical. Robert Darnton has pointed this out. He says, by 1858, when the British Raj begins to reconstitute itself as a modern bureaucratic state, book publishing had become an important industry, and the Indian civil service began to keep track of it. This resulted in complicated bureaucratic paperwork that attempt to identify, record, and evaluate the various literary as well as journalistic work that went on in different Indian languages. So, this perhaps the reason why we have evidences of proscribed material even today is because the British also kept track of, or tried to keep track of, not very successfully, as I later point out, all printed material that was produced in various parts of India in different languages. Now, the awareness of different languages of India gives rise to another act, which is the Vernacular Press Act of 1878, which was another step on the path to more scrutiny and control of the language newspapers. The colonial administrators were increasingly wary of the Bhasha press because they realized that the country they had come to rule over spoke in multitudinous tongues that they did not understand and hence could not control. They also believed that the mutineers were able to communicate with each other using symbols and ciphers they could not decode, and they needed to know better to control better. So the information they needed, they thought, came from primarily through print. Knowledge was power in this context. So the British built up an elaborate bureaucratic network that overlooked the regulation and control of printed matter. So this was somewhat the hierarchy. It operated from Whitehall, London, where the Secretary of State and an advisory Indian council oversaw the affairs of the colony. The government of India, that is on Indian shores, consisted of the Governor General or the Viceroy and the Executive Council, who was responsible for the formulation and implementation of policies. The immediate subordinates were the local governments in provinces and presidencies. There were also civil service officers who were in charge of districts, who were empowered to take decisions at the local level. So this was supposedly a very efficient system of communication intelligence, but for the sustenance of this bureaucratic machine, importantly, the British needed to know what Indians thought and did so that they could formulate policies which were effective and efficient at controlling them. So the Press and Registration of Books Act of 1867 was a major step in this measure. So it was a sort of watchdog measure which was promulgated for the regulation of printing presses and newspapers, for the preservation of copies of books printed in British India, and the registration of such books. So all the books, which means that now all books had to be identified. They had to bear the names of authors, printers, and publishers. The idea being that the people behind publications could be identified and held responsible if need be. Publishers had to register the book, paying a fee of 2 rupees and obtain copyright. And if they failed to comply, that would have made the publication illegal, which was again an offense, punishable by imprisonment and a heavy fine. Local administrators were expected to compile the information about printed material at their level and send them to higher authorities for action. No, this was all very fine on paper, but meticulous plans on paper tend to founder when it confronts practical reality. The cataloging had to be done by native officers, who also had to translate newspaper reports and prepare summaries. This was done because of the perception, especially of the Home Office in London, that this was a dependable indicator of the common man's thinking. However, the native officers' idiosyncratic notions and subjective perceptions about the substance and worth of the material often distorted the end product that reached the colonial masters, with the result that it was often a refracted reality that reached London. Now, see, the problem with cataloging was that sometimes it became difficult to slot the works according to their domains. As has already been pointed out by Professor Singer, some of these songs or lyrics which were very subversive in nature did not actually catch the attention of the censors, so to speak, because they very often fail to understand the pulse of the people. So even the local people, sometimes philosophical tracks had a lot of mythology in them, so they tended to categorize them as mythology without really paying much attention to them. Whereas, as has already been pointed out, mythology could be used for very subversive purposes. So, although it looked very neat on paper, the end result was often very messy. For example, a report from Bombay, I mean, this is the input given by a local administrator in Bombay, furnished information about the trial and conviction of Bal Gangadhar Tilak's newspaper, Kesari. So it mentioned all the numerous newspaper articles that had been printed in support of the trial. And one report that it mentions, it says the report calls the trial a mockery of justice, which is, if you think of it, is very clearly an open criticism of the way in which the trial was conducted by the British. But the newspaper claimed that this particular article was printed just to give the Marathi reading public an idea of the extent of liberty of reading and writing enjoyed by the people of India under the British government, and how far political agitation can be carried on without infringing the law, which was a very clever way of getting past the censors, if you think of it. But so the administrator who sent in this report does not focus or did not focus on this troublesome aspect of the newspaper report. Instead, it focused on another report, which was a review of a play called Lokmata Vijaya, or the Triumph of Public Opinion, which supported the government action against Tilak. So these were some of the loopholes. So Robert Darnton, who has written about book production in India, says that many of these reports were misleading. And although some reports do mention the rise of a broad spirit of disaffection towards the ruling class, the local governments did not consider it serious enough to be acted upon. Therefore, he makes what I think is a rather debatable claim. Strictly speaking, political censorship did not exist in British India, and many books circulated freely, even though they had been described as seditious in their catalogues. Unlike 18th century France, the 19th century Raj never developed an important literary underground. So basically here the problem was not that the people were not vociferous enough in their criticism of the British Raj, but that the censors were not very intelligent enough or clever enough to detect sedition when they saw it. And sometimes even the surveillance measures had a liberal face. And one such liberal face, one example that I'm giving you is of James Long, who many of you must already be familiar with. So James Long was a missionary and he founded the Vernacular Literature Society in Calcutta. He was fluent in Bengali and well acquainted with local customs and cultural practices, and with official support, undertook a thorough survey of all the literature printed in Bengali between 1857 and 1858. Now, Long did this, he volunteered to do this because he believed that keeping track of literature and what the people expressed through their various performances, songs, etc., would give the British an idea of what the Indians were really thinking, or the Bengalis were really thinking. He was meticulous in his recording and cataloging, and became so enamored of the material that he read. So this was an effect which people could not really predict or anticipate. So rather than being critical of what he read, Long is actually falling in love with Bengali. And he produced a panoramic view of Bengali literature in general, measured by statistics and colored by sympathetic readings of the books themselves. But despite all the sympathy that he felt for Bengali, his considered opinion was that Bengali novels were nowhere near European novels in terms of literary merit. One writer he mentions by name was Bharat Chandra, whose novel was Shishubodh. And he does admit that it is the most popular book in indigenous schools, but it was replete with loose morals and mythology. So one thing which constantly irked the British, who were very Victorian in their attitude, was the preponderance of what they considered to be obscenity in various Indian works. So the same thing happened with Long. Nevertheless, Long shared the Victorian liberal sentiments with respect to books, and believed that they could be civilizing forces that could break the chains of superstitions and ignorant customs among the Hindus. Rather paradoxically, he urged the British to desist from censorship and promote freedom of expression, because his argument was that enlightenment can liberate the natives from their state of uneducated torpor. Long also exemplifies the dangers inherent in an attempt to objectively record and catalogue literary works. As is obvious, it became a very subjective assessment colored by individual tastes and preferences. The firm belief in the superiority of the European mind, however, did not prevent Long from espousing the cause of the Bengali peasant who was exploited by the zamindars. His zeal led to his publication of Deenbandhu Mitra's play Neel Darpan, translated by Michael Madhusudan Dutt, and Long himself ironically became the victim of censorship because he was imprisoned and he was fined for aiding in the publication of Neel Darpan. By 1860, the Indian Penal Code was in existence. But what we see interestingly is that rather than frame a comprehensive and well-planned policy to deal with freedom of expression, various laws under the Penal Code were used to deal with freedom of expression. Laws governing unlawful assembly, riots, offenses against the state, public morality and decency, religion, defamation, and the like were used against free speech. Laws were later added as contingency measures that were an immediate response to critical situations. So some emergency, some crisis occurs, so then immediately a law was framed to take care of that situation. So in 1870, a threat from religious fanatics led to the imposition of Section 124A, which is to control sedition. That law still stands. So this the sedition law says that anybody who brings or attempts to bring into hatred or contempt, or excites or attempts to excite disaffection towards Her Majesty, would be punished. Growing Hindu-Muslim tensions led to the implementation of Section 153A, which, again, that same section is applicable today also. It's a culpable offense to promote enmity between different groups on the ground of religion, race, place of birth, residence, language, etc. So the loopholes of this legislation were highlighted by the controversial trial and exoneration of the Urdu pamphlet Rangila Rasool. So I think many of the speakers in this conference are talking about Rangila Rasool. So Rangila Rasool highlighted the problem with 153A because the judge who overturned the decision to ban Rangila Rasool observed that Section 153A was concerned only with offense to religion and not with attacks on religious leaders. Immediately you had another law that was framed to deal with it, which was Section 295A. So this is what I mean by laws as responses to various critical situations. Now, despite the plethora of laws on paper, the official attitude to the implementation was rather lackadaisical. So the barrier, Gerald Barrier has this to say, the bureaucracy remained concerned with what Indians printed, particularly in times of crisis such as the mutiny or a disturbance on the frontier. But the limited scope of Indian journalism and the general reluctance of editors seriously to confront British authority did not seem to justify legislating punitive measures. But here you have to remember that perhaps this was because a whole lot of material that was being printed or that was being circulated among the various bhashas in India never really caught the attention of the British. Perhaps another reason could have been that. So there was a temporary lull at this point, and that ended with the eruption of violence that followed the partition of Bengal in 1905 by Lord Curzon. It was evident that a groundswell of public opinion had been building up against the colonial government, aided in a large measure by the literature that was now produced and distributed by printing presses scattered across the country. The literary and non-literary works exhorted for political change, an end to British rule, and there was an open call for self-rule for Indians. Literature and journalism became potent weapons in the hands of Indians. Bal Gangadhar Tilak's newspaper Kesari and Aurobindo's Yugantar are examples of militant journalism. So the British then was smothered by this mass of printed material that an officer is, in one of his communiques, he says, we are overwhelmed with a mass of heterogeneous material, some of it misguided, some of it frankly seditious, the mere bulk of which, to say nothing of its chaotic character, renders it unmanageable. This mass of matter has already got beyond our control. So this is like an open admission of complete helplessness. Faced by an increasingly hostile press that spoke in languages that they barely knew or understood, the British officers very often found themselves engaged in a fight with shadows. The Minto-Morley reforms of 1909, which limited the control of the British over local legislatures, further aggravated the division within administrative ranks with respect to controls over the press. So this is where I mentioned the incident right at the beginning, how Lord Minto and John Morley could never arrive at a consensus regarding freedom of expression in India. So result was there did not seem to be a comprehensive policy regarding this in British India, and official action tended to be responses to immediate crises rather than products of careful planning. Increasing acts of violence, like the assassination of Curzon Wiley by Madan Lal Dhingra in 1909 and the attempt on Lord Minto's life, reinforced the British resolve to exert more force in dealing with dissidents. Even the liberal Morley had to give his assent to bans on newspapers. But as is the case usually, when censorship becomes harsher, the attempts to circumvent it also become more innovative and clever. So the ingenuity of the subversives grew in proportion. They began to smuggle in proscribed pamphlets. Sometimes they were stuffed in self-improvement manuals or even sewn into innocuous books such as Oliver Twist. So it was in this atmosphere of violence that you have the passing of the Press Act of 1910. The bill had three main objectives. So Barrier says that there were three main objectives, that it was to increase governmental control over printing press and publishers, and to enforce that they would forfeit the deposit that they had to initially hand over if they were found guilty of printing objectionable material. Second, the bureaucratic control over import and circulation of problematic material increased. So now the post office and the customs office, they could step in and they could control, they could check the material that was flowing within across the provinces within India and impound material if they thought that it was a problem. Third, it authorized local governments to ban any newspaper, book, or other printed material. So this decentralized system of control met with stiff opposition from Indians, unsurprisingly, and leaders like Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Madan Mohan Malaviya, and people like them expressed their dissent. But still, the Press Act was passed. But the interesting aspect about the Act is that, like the earlier legislations, the Act in practice on the ground was a different creature from the Act on paper. The Act empowered local administrators further, which made the India office more dependent on them for information. The vagueness of guidelines regarding procedure led to a lack of uniformity in the surveillance and control of material in different parts of India. Punjab, for instance, did not believe in additional measures of scrutiny because they claimed that a majority of Indians sided with the government. Hindu reporters exaggerated the potential threat of Muslim books and vice versa. So the surveys of books, like the version of Long, tended to be colored by individual preferences and prejudices. In the works of the director of the CID director, the reporting system was an Augean table with material strongly tinged with the individuality and race of the officers who write them. So as before, the well laid out schemes of the British went awry when confronted with Indian reality. Now, another major turning point, which was the outbreak of World War I. And this caused a rather disarray in the ranks of the government, but we see a rise in nationalist fervor. So the taking advantage of the disarray in the governmental ranks, the revolutionary groups stepped up the intensity of their activities. Crises like these demanded immediate retribution, and the censorship apparatus was made to swing into action with redoubled force. So the Post Office and Customs Office, which already we have seen how the Press Act of 1910 made them capable or gave them the official power to confiscate material that was considered suspicious. Provincial press committees were constituted to provide better channels of communication between India office and local administrations. So despite the ferocity of suppressive measures, subversive material seemed to thrive. The government, which had been wary of suppressing presses and making them lose their deposit money, now did not hesitate to do so. So one such case was that of the Zamindar, which is run by Muhammad Ali. So the press lost its security deposit of 2,000 rupees. But very soon, it was able to collect 10,000 rupees and deposit it and start publishing again. The reason being that Muhammad Ali did not find it difficult to collect 10,000 from his subscribers because, paradoxically, the governmental action against the press had only increased the number of subscribers and its popularity. So this wartime intensity eased a little as there was growing opposition to the Press Act of 1910. Edwin Montagu, the Secretary of State from 1917, was uncomfortable with the arbitrary and unfair repressive measures. His view was that undue coercion would only reinforce opposition to the government, which in retrospect proved to be a very sensible and considered opinion, because the violence that erupted in 1919, especially after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, lent more credence to his opinion. The government was forced to introspect, and a modified press bill was introduced in 1921. This bill narrowed the grounds on which material could be banned. However, restrictions increased in proportion to the fervor of oppositional movements raised by nationalist groups. Along with this, we also see a rising concern with communal tensions and legislation that sought to defuse them. But as Rajesh Dhawan is pointing out, the creation of such offenses was communal in its result, if not purpose and intent. They led to a forum for the faiths to use the code to fight one another through the law. A provision for peace could thus be excited to hatred and distrust. So this is an ironical outcome of a law that was meant to ensure communal harmony. So from this point onwards, from 1930 onwards, after 1919, 1920, when the civil disobedience movement is gaining in momentum, and both communal tensions and the rising fervor of nationalist movements are leading to increased fervor in curbing or suppressing material again. But still we find this sort of seesaw. The restrictions on free expression follow the pattern of relaxation and control till 1947. But the censorship mechanism is getting harsher. It is synchronizing with the high points of the nationalist movement, like the declaration of Purna Swaraj in 1930 or the Quit India movement in 1942. But along with these repressive system, there is another form, what is not necessarily considered to be censorship, but a different form of image building and what appears to be positive, but an image building exercise and a way of controlling people's thought, which is the soft and persuasive power of propaganda. So newspapers were sponsored by the government. Newspapers like the Indian Gazette, Calcutta Gazette, and Madras Courier, which were supported by the government. And of course, it goes without saying that they were not censored at all. Besides published partisan reports in the guise of objective news, the government decided to engage in direct image building exercises. So what the people receive from these newspapers as objective reports are actually versions fed by the government. So in a way, it is not censorship in the sense of it is hiding or suppressing news, but it is actively propounding or actively encouraging the spread of false news or fake news, if you want to call it. Consequently, the Central Bureau of Information was formed during the First World War and the Bureau of Press Information during the Second World War. They provided the official version of events, which became the declared truth. Contesting it would have amounted to sedition. But at the same time, along with this interest in propaganda, the British were very concerned about their image. So open suppression of dissident voices would have dented the liberal image that the British government had carefully built up at home. So the local governments were instructed to take action against presses if they were found guilty of printing seditious material. But they were not to be formally banned because it would have amounted to bad publicity. So I'm coming to the conclusion. The British Empire thus seemed to play Jekyll and Hyde in the matter of free expression in India. It had to put up a democratic front on its own shores, while it had to rule autocratically over what they called the barbarian citizens of the colonies. As I've already mentioned, this resulted in rather quixotic situations, where the desire for complete control had to be tempered with the concern for democratic principles of free speech. India Office administrators like John Morley and Edwin Montagu demurred when faced with the prospect of harsher restrictions, because the Secretary of State would have found himself answerable to a horde of hostile questions from the opposition benches in Parliament. Willing to wound and yet afraid to strike, the British Empire vacillated between strict control of free speech and tolerance of dissident expressions. This ambiguity at the heart of British legislation on free speech is perhaps something we have unfortunately carried over into independent India, traces of which we see in the caveat that is attached to Article 19(1) that guarantees freedom of expression as a fundamental right. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mini Chandran, for taking us on this chronological journey, if I may say so, of the gagging and letting speak policies of the colonial Raj, and acquainting us with the loopholes in the system that enabled the publications to negotiate with the system. Thank you so much. Now, as we have come towards the close of the first session, I would like to call upon Dr. Ravi Khan. So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Divya. Thank you. Professor Chandran, I'm using another laptop, Ashutosh's. This is a really wonderful journey of the legislative process, and laid out the various aspects chronologically as well as analytically. The question that I have is about this emergence of a commons, as it were, which is, ethical commons, which are also peopled by the nationalist leaders. And not just nationalist leaders, but also, rebels and revolutionaries. And there are moments when the colonial authorities and the nationalists and other, leaders are on the same page. There will be discussions on obscenity, for example, in Charu's paper and other papers that will follow. A parallel court emerges. The court of, the newspaper editors, the court of Gandhi. So all these, new agencies emerge that, are trying to sometimes fight the colonial state, but sometimes they're also urging the colonial authorities to censor certain things. So there lies also the continuity between the colonial government and the post-colonial governments that follow. So would you agree? How would you see this history? The emergence of an ethical commons, which is much more diverse than just the colonial authority.
Thank you for that question. Yes, in fact, one of the things which strikes you is how there is this trend. I mean, there is a continuity in this legislation. I'm sorry. Am I audible? Yeah. Okay. The continuity in the trend of legislation that we find from British India to, so we have inherited our laws, so to speak, from the British. So what you call this ethical code, or what you call the extrajudicial or the extra administrative form of censorship, which I would term the censorship by the mob, for example, that is a very worrying trend. Because actually, what we see today is that the people, as people, we ourselves are asking for censorship from the government, especially with regard to obscenity and offensive. What you consider to be offensive. I mean, even the other day, we find people calling for Kangana Ranaut to be punished for making those comments about independence. Right, so it's not the government that is imposing the ban, but we seem to be encouraged to ask for bans. That definitely is a worrying trend. And also, many of the concepts of obscenity and the notions of sedition, etc. I don't think there has been much change from colonial times to the present. That seems to have continued as such without major changes to to contemporary India. In fact, I stopped with 1947, so I did not look at what happened after 47. So I think you are correct. I agree with you.
That's fair. So, are there other questions? Or comments? Message box. What I will do is I will upload the images that Professor Shahid Amin would not show and on the chat box. But that will happen later after we meet in the next session. Professor Gajendra Pathak wants me to thank everybody, the chairperson, Professor Menon and Professor Saraju, and the speakers, Professor Shahid Amin, Professor Mini Chandran, and Professor Wendy Singer for their valuable insights in the inaugural session. This will guide us a lot in the coming days as the project progresses. We'll give you more trouble, maybe next year, maybe in the year next, but this is just a good starting point for us. A lot there on the table to think about, to chew upon. So thanks a lot for guiding us. Everybody, thanks a lot, Divya, for conducting this. Thanks a lot, everybody, for listening in. And I'm really sorry for all the technical glitches. We are trying really hard to, work from various locations and across various chunks. Apologies once again, and thanks a lot. We will break for lunch and we'll meet after at 2 o'clock. Join in again. Thanks a lot.
Okay, sir. Thank you.